In the year 1305, the daily life of London unfolded with its usual sounds, the calls of merchants selling their goods and the rhythmic striking of horses' hooves against the stone-paved roads. Yet on a particular morning in August, this familiar clamor was destined to be drowned out by another noise, the collective voice of a crowd, hungry for violence, assembling to observe an event that would be recorded as one of the most infamous executions in history. The individual they had come to watch perish was William Wallace, the Scottish warrior who had audaciously challenged the authority of the English monarch and rallied his people to resist foreign dominion. What took place on that day was not a simple act of capital punishment. It was a meticulously planned spectacle of suffering, conceived to annihilate not only a man, but also the ideal he embodied. The common perception, influenced by cinematic portrayals and romanticized histories, has softened the grim details of Wallace's end, presenting it as a somewhat dignified and swift end for a valiant hero. The truth, however, was far more dreadful and immeasurably more savage. King Edward I, also known as Longshanks, had devised Wallace's fate not merely as a form of payback, but as a statement so powerful it would resonate for centuries. The intention was to orchestrate a death so ghastly, so public, and so meticulously recorded that it would stand as a stark deterrent to any who might contemplate defying English rule. The method selected was hanging, drawing, and quartering, a sentence reserved for those accused of treason and the very definition of state-sanctioned brutality in medieval England. This was not about ending a life, it was about the methodical dismantling of a person's self-worth, the erasure of all hope, and the staging of a performance so shocking it would be seared into the collective memory of the Scottish people for ages. We will now move past the legend to investigate the unvarnished facts of William Wallace's last day. The journey from Scotland to London was, in itself, an exercise in torment, intended to crush Wallace's resolve before his public punishment. Chained and heavily guarded, he was paraded through English towns where crowds flocked to stare at the notorious Scottish insurgent. This was a calculated form of mental warfare aimed at turning a hero into a sideshow and a leader into an object of morbid curiosity. By the time he arrived in London, Wallace had already been subjected to weeks of humiliation, but his suffering was far from complete. The trial of William Wallace was a mere formality, but it fulfilled a crucial propaganda role for the English monarchy. Conducted at Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305, the hearing was held in Latin, a tongue that Wallace probably could not comprehend. He stood accused of treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, and a list of other offenses against the English state. The profound contradiction of the situation was clear to many at the time. Wallace was being prosecuted for betraying a king whose authority he had never accepted. When finally allowed to speak, Wallace is said to have proclaimed that he could not be a traitor to Edward I, as he had never been his subject. This act of defiance solidified his doom, though the verdict was never in doubt. The trial was a piece of political theater, staged to lend an air of legality to what was, in effect, a prearranged killing. The judges, all chosen by King Edward, had no intention of granting clemency to the figurehead of Scottish opposition. The accusations against Wallace were meticulously composed to warrant the harshness of his sentence. Treason was the gravest charge, carrying the full terror of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. The supplementary charges of murder and sacrilege, which related to his assaults on English garrisons and church properties, were included to paint him as a common outlaw rather than a captured soldier. The English justice system had been transformed into an instrument of state intimidation, and Wallace was destined to be its most high-profile casualty. The sentence was delivered with solemn pageantry. Wallace was to be dragged through the streets of London, suspended by the neck, but not until he was dead, disemboweled while still living, decapitated, and his corpse divided into 4 sections. Every component of this sentence was rich with symbolic weight. The dragging signified his public shame, the hanging his denial from heaven, the disembowelment his moral decay, and the quartering his utter obliteration. This was not simply an execution, it was total destruction. The morning of August 23, 1305, broke bright and warm over London. The capital had been preparing for this public event for several days. Scaffolding had been built, and spectators had come from all over England to see the demise of the Scottish rebel. The government had effectively made Wallace's execution into a public festival, where people sold food and beverages to the gathered crowds. This was not solely about administering justice, it was also a form of public amusement and a stark exhibition of the English crown's might and the destiny that awaited its challengers. Wallace was first stripped of his clothes and fastened to a hurdle, a wooden sled designed to drag him through London's streets. The path was deliberately chosen to heighten both his disgrace and the public display. Starting from the Tower of London, where he was imprisoned, the procession wound its way through the most crowded parts of the city, guaranteeing that the maximum number of people would see his abasement. The rough stones of the street tore at his skin as horses pulled him, leaving a bloody path that traced his final route. The throngs of people lining the way were a mix of the idly curious, fervent English nationalists and individuals who simply took pleasure in watching the suffering of others. Medieval executions were communal affairs, functioning as both diversion and pointed lessons in royal authority. Onlookers taunted and pelted Wallace with garbage as he was pulled along, their actions actively supported by the authorities, who sought to make his last hours as degrading as possible. This was an immense, government-endorsed display of inhumanity. The procession advanced at a slow pace, providing ample time for the crowds to swell and for Wallace's agony to be drawn out. Historical records state that he remained conscious for the entire ordeal, his gaze directed toward some unseen point, as if he could see past the immediate terror of his circumstances. Whether this was an act of defiance, a state of acceptance, or simply a reaction to the shock is impossible to know, but observers remarked that he did not scream or plead for his life, a fact that would later become a key part of his legend. At Smithfield, London's customary site for executions, a platform had been constructed specifically for Wallace's death. The assembly of people here was even more numerous and rowdy than along the parade route, with vendors hawking snacks and drinks to those who had arrived early to secure the best vantage points. The festive mood was intentional. The English government wanted Wallace's death to be remembered not as the creation of a martyr, but as a triumphant moment for English law and authority. The executioner, a professional who had likely conducted many similar procedures, commenced his task with rehearsed precision. Wallace was first lifted by a rope around his neck, but it was placed to cause strangulation rather than the swift death that comes from a broken neck. The crowd looked on as he choked, his face becoming discolored and his body twitching in the spasms of suffocation. Just as he was about to lose consciousness, he was lowered, still breathing, still lucid. What came next was the most dreadful stage of the entire event. With Wallace still conscious, the executioner started the process of gutting him. With a sharp blade, he sliced open Wallace's belly and began pulling out his internal organs, one after another. Contemporary records speak of the victim's screams as being unlike anything the onlookers had ever heard, a noise that seemed to well up from the deepest pits of human agony. The executioner displayed each organ to the crowd before casting it into a specially prepared fire. The symbolism of incinerating Wallace's entrails was deliberate. In the medieval mindset, the bowels were thought to be the center of one's emotions and moral character. By burning them as he watched, the executioner was symbolically annihilating Wallace's very being, making him something less than human in the eyes of the spectators. The smell of burning flesh and organs permeated the air, adding another sensory horror to the already ghastly spectacle. Throughout all of this, Wallace was reportedly still conscious, his eyes open and seeing, even as his body was being systematically taken apart. Some records imply that he was still trying to speak, although his final words have not been preserved by history. The executioner's expertise was not just in inflicting the greatest amount of pain, but in keeping the condemned man alive for as long as possible. Death was to be a relief, not the climax of the punishment. Finally and mercifully, the executioner proceeded to the final act of his grim duty. Wallace's head was removed from his body with a single, clean strike of a heavy axe, at last putting an end to his torment. Yet, even after death, the indignity persisted. The head was presented to the crowd, blood still flowing from the neck, before being taken away for its later use as a public warning. The rest of the body was then hacked into 4 pieces, with each part held up for the crowd's viewing, like portions of meat at a butcher's stall. The handling of Wallace's remains was as methodical as his execution. His head was coated in tar for preservation, and then impaled on a spike on London Bridge, where it would stay for many years as a grim notice to anyone who might contemplate opposing English rule. The 4 sections of his body were dispatched to 4 different cities in Scotland: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, where they were put on public display as reminders of the destiny awaiting those who rebelled. This scattering of Wallace's body parts was more than just savage. It was a form of political messaging. Each piece acted as a communication to the local inhabitants, a tangible symbol of English might and the price of defiance. The English leadership knew that ideas and symbols could be as potent as military force, and Wallace's dismembered corpse became a powerful emblem of England's control over Scotland. The immediate consequence of Wallace's execution was precisely what King Edward had intended. The horrifying display appeared to have achieved its goal. Scottish opposition seemed to collapse in the face of such a formidable show of English force. Many who had once backed Wallace either escaped the country or submitted to English authority, reasoning that no cause could be worth such a gruesome end. The execution had seemingly succeeded in turning a symbol of defiance into a symbol of deterrence. King Edward, however, had made a critical error in judgment regarding the long-term Scottish reaction. Instead of extinguishing the spirit of Scottish resistance, the sheer barbarity of Wallace's execution ultimately fortified it. The terror of his death transformed into a powerful inspiration for those who would not bow to English supremacy. Robert the Bruce, who would rise to become King of Scotland, was said to have been spurred into decisive action by the sight of Wallace's fate, recognizing in it the true nature of English governance. The manner of Wallace's death also shaped the future methods of Scottish resistance. The message was unmistakable. Being captured by the English guaranteed a fate of torture and degradation beyond comprehension. This realization fostered a more ferocious and unyielding style of combat, where Scottish warriors came to favor dying in battle over the possibility of surrender. Wallace's execution had cultivated a no-mercy approach to warfare, where clemency was neither anticipated nor offered. The political fallout reached beyond the borders of Scotland. Other European monarchies observed the execution of Wallace with a mixture of fascination and alarm, viewing it as a display of English tactics that could potentially be used against them. The brutality of the act became part of England's international image, contributing to a sense of isolation that would later create challenges in its foreign relations. Edward I's message of might had been understood, but so had his message of cruelty. The historical record of Wallace's execution is remarkably thorough, compiled from numerous contemporary sources that offer a very clear picture of what happened. The Lanercost Chronicle, composed by English monks, recounts the execution with detached precision, commenting on the crowd's response and the length of Wallace's suffering. These records, while leaning towards an English viewpoint, give us important clues about medieval ideas of justice and punishment. Scottish sources, although not as numerous, present an alternative view of the event. The Chronicle of John of Fordun depicts Wallace as a martyr who met his end with fortitude and grace, highlighting his refusal to plead for his life or disavow his convictions. These narratives, while possibly idealized, capture the profound effect of Wallace's death on the Scottish national psyche and the process by which a military loss was remade into a moral triumph. The legal documents from Wallace's trial and sentence offer what is likely the most factual report of the proceedings. These papers, kept in the English National Archives, show the meticulous organization that went into both the legal process and the execution itself. Every element was recorded, from the specific accusations against Wallace to the final disposition of his body parts, which implies that the English government was aware of the historical weight of its actions. Eyewitness statements from both English and Scottish observers add further layers of detail. Some describe the crowd's ravenous excitement, while others emphasize the apparent composure with which Wallace met his fate. These diverse accounts underscore the complexity of the event and how it was perceived differently by various groups. The legacy of William Wallace's execution reaches far beyond the immediate political results of his demise. In the centuries that followed, his story evolved into a cornerstone story in the identity of the Scottish nation, motivating countless generations of Scots to stand against foreign control. The very cruelty of his end elevated him from a defeated rebel to a figure of martyrdom and defiance, proving to be more influential in death than he had been in life. The execution also had an impact on the evolution of international legal standards and ideas about human decency. Future legal thinkers would reference Wallace's treatment as a prime example of judicial savagery that went against the basic tenets of human dignity. The concept that even a nation's enemies are entitled to humane treatment started to develop, partly in response to extreme cases like Wallace's execution. The cultural footprint of Wallace's death is evident in the literature, art, and songs that appeared in the following eras. From medieval folk songs to contemporary movies, his story has been recounted repeatedly, with each new generation discovering fresh significance in his personal sacrifice. The scene of his execution, in particular, has become an enduring emblem of the conflict between oppression and liberty and between tyranny and justice. The psychological effect on the Scottish population was deep and enduring. Wallace's execution forged a collective wound that became embedded in Scottish cultural identity, a shared memory of pain that bonded the nation in a way that military success alone never could have. The horror of his death became a wellspring of resilience, showing that some principles are worth enduring for and that personal honor can be preserved even in the face of complete ruin. The method of execution chosen for Wallace, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was in itself a declaration about the character of medieval justice and the dynamic between a ruler and his people. This specific punishment was designated for traitors, individuals who had broken the sacred trust between a king and his populace. By using it on Wallace, Edward IV was forcefully stating that every person living in the British Isles was his subject, regardless of whether they accepted his authority. The public character of the execution was just as important. Medieval justice was a form of theater intended to strengthen social order and political power through public display. Wallace's execution was arguably the most grand and detailed performance of its time, involving not just the physical annihilation of the condemned, but also the mental conditioning of the spectators. The crowd was not simply observing justice, it was taking part in a ceremony of state dominance. The exhaustive documentation of the execution implies that the English government knew it was shaping a historical narrative. The precise recording of every aspect, from the route of the procession to the final placement of the body parts, shows that this event was meant to be remembered. The execution was not solely about punishing Wallace, it was about constructing a version of events that would benefit English ambitions for years to come. The international context of the execution is also significant. Medieval Europe was a highly connected region where information spread rapidly, and a nation's reputation was crucial. Wallace's execution was observed by foreign representatives, and its story was shared across the continent, shaping England's image as a nation prepared to employ extreme tactics to preserve its power. This reputation would go on to affect its diplomatic relationships for many years. As we consider the horror of William Wallace's execution, we are forced to face difficult truths about the human condition and the use of power. The crowds that came together to watch him suffer were not inhuman monsters. They were regular people who had been taught to accept and even find pleasure in the methodical annihilation of another person. Their excitement for the event shows the potential for cruelty that lies within any society when such behavior is officially approved. The execution also reveals how quickly something shocking can become normalized. The man who dismembered Wallace was a professional, trained in the practice of extending agony. The officials who planned the event were administrators carrying out standard protocols for handling traitors. The acceptance of extreme cruelty as routine is perhaps even more unsettling than the cruelty itself, hinting that the veneer of civilization is always thinner than we might imagine. The transformation of Wallace from a rebel into a martyr highlights the unpredictable power of political symbols. Edward the Fern meant for the execution to prove that resistance was pointless, but it instead forged a potent symbol of the nobility of sacrificing for one's beliefs. The very extremity of the execution contributed to its failure as a deterrent. The horror was so absolute that it became something greater, transcending its initial aim to become a larger idea. The lasting fascination with Wallace's story reflects our deep-seated need for heroes who represent our highest values, especially when faced with ultimate suffering. His execution serves as a reminder that the most significant victories are sometimes moral rather than military, that dignity can be preserved when all else is lost, and that the human spirit can find a way to triumph even at the moment of the body's utter destruction. The story of William Wallace's execution is, in the end, a story about the cost of freedom and the high price of principle. In our own comfortable modern lives, it is easy to lose sight of the fact that the liberties we often assume as given were paid for with the lives and suffering of those who came before us. Wallace's terrible death is a powerful reminder that freedom is never guaranteed, and that those who benefit from it have a duty to honor the sacrifice of those who died to secure it. Today, as we contend with our own threats to liberty and human dignity, Wallace's story is as relevant as ever. The specific methods may have evolved, but the essential conflict between oppression and freedom persists. His execution reminds us that there are some principles worth suffering for, some causes worth dying for, and that the decision between freedom and security is one that every generation is forced to make for itself. The blood-stained stones of medieval London still seem to echo with the message that some things are worth any cost, and that the human spirit, even when it is broken, can still move others to continue to fight.